We begin our general discussion on this panel, 30 minutes, because then we conclude with a Holy Mass. So I have two voices registered here, Professor Donati, Professor Buttiglione, and Jeremy Rossman. Would you like as well? Okay, so in this order, and then I will try to follow with the coming voices. Professor Donati, please go ahead.
Thank you. I want to give some comments, some hints, like a research track or a methodological line of work after having heard the presentations. Many of us have said that we need to keep together many potential dimensions of the disasters going on the Earth. There is the pandemic, the ecological crisis or climate crisis, the economic crisis, the social crisis, etc., etc. How can we unite all these crises? I mean, they have something together to be explained. And in my mind, what is at the grassroots of all these crises is what we call catastrophes. We need a theory of catastrophes, a unitary theory of catastrophes. So to understand why all these crises are linked to one another, and we expect recurrent catastrophes in the future. So we cannot, as many said, to deal with the social dimension, then the economic dimension, then the ecological dimension, etc., separately. We have to unite them, and the unification is given by the theory of catastrophes. Now, what is a catastrophe? A catastrophe is a phenomenon which has a hyperbolic trend. That is, it increases in a hyperbolic way unless we stop the phenomenon at a certain break-even point, at a point which is in fact an inflection point where we can keep the phenomenon not going so fast and so high as in a hyperbola, but we can reduce the phenomenon to a logistic trend, to a logistic line, so to avoid the catastrophe. Now, the point is that we have to explain what is the relational structure of this inflection point. The inflection point is where social relations are kept in such a way as to solve all the dimensions we have. I mean, a kind of social relationality in a community can keep the economic crisis, the ecological crisis, the pandemic all under control, because relations in the community are kept in such a way as to keep all these dimensions together. So what we need is a study, an understanding of the operator which can stop the diffusion of certain relations which bring the catastrophe, that is the pandemic, the ecological crisis, and so on and so forth. So we need to understand exactly what kind of relational reflexive mechanisms are operating at this inflection point towards a logistic line. If we don't understand that, also the economy of Pope Francis cannot be implemented, because we need to pass from a technocratic paradigm to a relational economy, a relational society, which means producing relational goods. And relational goods in the community can be produced only if we keep the relationality of the community in such a way as to avoid what the experts call the saturation of social relations. That is the fact that relations spread everywhere unless they are kept under control. So what the observation is that we need to get into a theory of catastrophes in order to keep all these crises together and know how to deal with them. That's my suggestion.
Thank you so much. Very interesting. I think it fits well with what Yanir Baryam was saying about complex systems, complex things happening. Now, please, Professor Buttiglione.
Thank you. I wish to continue. What is the inflection point? And I make a proposal. Really, it is not my proposal. It is a proposal that I think is in the spirit and in the head of Alexander and Mateusz, but they did not say that. And then I shall do. I try to interpret. We are very well aware of the fact that there is no way out because the treaties are inadequate. Life has moved much beyond the limits of the treatises, and in particular, social policies are not within the sphere of action of the European Union. They are almost completely, not quite, but to a very large extent, they are not dependent upon the European Union. Then, what about a movement? Something that changes things, not beginning giving good advice to the rulers, but mobilizing the basis, a movement from grassroots, a movement that says, we don't want anybody in Europe to starve. We want that everybody in Europe has enough to eat and a shelter and some clothing. And we want a kind of universal income for all Europeans who stand in need of having such an income. We know how the level of ingenuity that may be contained in this. So we know that it must be specified. There are those who cannot make a living through their work, and they must have this kind of income. There are those who can make a living, and in this case, the support must be limited in time, must be connected with orientation on the labor market and with professional training so that they can enter into the labor market. We know all this and many other details that we cannot discuss now. But what about this idea? Can this idea mobilize a movement starting from grassroots that puts pressure to bear on the decision makers? Because I have the impression that the decision makers, if left to themselves, they are not strong enough to do that or to get moving. There are many reasons why we should change the treatises and make new treatises. We need a common foreign policy. We need a common defense policy. The Americans are not willing anymore to spend their money to defend us. They are right. Therefore, we need a political government. You cannot have a defense policy, foreign policy. We need an economic policy. Today, the European Central Bank is acting completely beyond the limits of the treatises. Yeah. Thanks God. Otherwise, we would have collapsed. Nevertheless, it is a situation of illegality. The German Constitutional Court, well, it's not completely wrong when they say the court is the European Central Bank is moving beyond the limits. Only necessitas non habet legem. We all also know a bit of Latin. So necessity cannot be subdued to any law. Draghi acted in a situation of absolute necessity. Nevertheless, this needs to be regulated. You cannot have this power of the European Central Bank without the power of a European Minister of Economy. But these things will never be done unless there is a movement that starts from the basis, from the people. And I wonder if one fundamental element in this movement should be, we need more Europe, and we need more Europe for all these reasons, and also because we need a European common social policy. By the way, in the same room a few days ago, we have been discussing an idea that is even more ambitious, the idea of moving the world towards a universal minimal income for all human beings on Earth, which is much more difficult, even much more difficult, much more unrealistic. But when I was a young man, I would have been fascinated by a project like this. And I think that we could connect a project for Europe with a project, a broader project at the world level. If we do this, then the economy of Francesco finds a practical impulse, can become a practical force.
Thank you. This is a great voice. I'm just a suggestion from me just to keep it more concise, but in the same level of content. Now, please, Jeremy.
Thank you. So I just wanted to continue on with my question and just expand this question for all the panelists, which is just to say that in this session, we are talking about helping citizens directly. And we're talking about what needs to be done now to help people in the context of the pandemic, but also talking about the changes that need to occur to support and help all citizens. But there's also that group in the middle. There's the clinically vulnerable, there's the long COVID patients. The World Health Organization estimated that there are at least 133 million long COVID patients that have significant health burdens, but are also going to have significant burdens on health infrastructure, significant economic costs on countries, often in countries that do not have the resources or the health infrastructure to support that, let alone recognition of this disease. So how do we bridge this gap that goes from what we need to do acutely to resolve the pandemic to supporting all citizens? How do we make sure that we're doing that in a way that is not leaving anybody behind, that the economic policies that we're talking about and developing are accounting for all citizens?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you so much. I'm adding you on the list. Okay. A brief remark from me to the previous conversation. Coming back to what Professor Grodzicki said, there is much influence, much focus on the EU as EU single market instead of EU common economy, so to speak, and the recovery fund, the Next Generation EU, all of those funds can be used now to build better infrastructures. Now, we know some of it will go for digital infrastructure, green, so to modernize the physical infrastructures. But the question is, what about social infrastructure? What about intangible infrastructures? Is trust also not an infrastructure? And some countries have included things like social innovation, like shorter working weeks in their recovery plans. So it doesn't have to only be very hard infrastructure. It can also be public services treated as an investment in people, in people's health, in people's education. So this kind of approach would really build the resilience that Minister Professor Giovanni was talking about, as in resilience of society, which is trusted, healthy, strong social fabric. I think this is what prevents this inflection point in the end, if we have such a society. That's it from me. Now moving on, Alexander Temkin.
Okay, I will try to make it short. I'm not if I succeed. Okay, I want to polemize with Monsignor Sorondo and Excellency Roland Minera, because I want to propose another framework of problematization. I don't think that the atheization of Europe is a best framework, because I think that as we need both as Pope Benedictus wrote, there is a common ground between enlightenment and the evangelium, and we need both. We need both. And in my opinion, I'm afraid that the crisis, this cultural crisis connected with COVID, is deeper. It's a crisis both of the tradition of enlightenment and, unfortunately, in the same time, the crisis of many religious, the crisis of religion. I'm saying it with deep regret because I'm Roman Catholic myself, and it's very important for my activity. I take the words of imitating the Christ personally, and the sentence of Pope Francis that the politics is the highest form of charity is very important for me. But we are observing that, as many people said, that many Christians reject the vaccination, and not only vaccination, masking and other measures of public health. And I think it's a moral crisis. It's not the crisis of the trust in science. I think that we are seeing the instrumentalization, the culture of instrumentalization on both sides. In post-enlightenment side, and unfortunately, many times we are seeing the instrumentalization of the name of our Lord in our own church. So it's really painful for me personally. So, and because of that, I think it's rather crisis of instrumentalization than crisis of just atheization.
Thank you. Very interesting voice. Now I will tell what is the order. Professor Pozzo and Professor Grodzicki, then Director Splimbergo, Deputy Director, yes, and then Professor Zamani. And if we have enough time, we will also have another voices. So please keep it concise. Thank you.
When we have the right to replay the question, because they put question for us.
Right. It seems that most of this are statements, not really questions.
No, a question.
No, it is.
If it's a question, then
May I say a word? I think you addressed the point which needs to be clarified. Today in Europe, the point is there is no common narrative. You see what I mean? A narrative. You had a narrative on the meaning of life under Christianity. You had one under Enlightenment. In Enlightenment, it was progress, science, progress, and humanity will be happier. Okay, now this has disappeared. Now we are facing a situation in which the human being is dismantled. It is no longer recognized as something specific in creation. You have all these ecologist ideologies which say the human beings are predators, are destroyers of nature, and should disappear as soon as possible. All these are things which are circulating in Europe, in the world, and we should take this into account, because when we say that we should modify, change structures and so on. Okay, we need it, but on the basis of what narrative? What are we telling to the people? What is the need of making changes? What is the final sense of life? This is the point. We are missing this dimension in our European discourse. But it seems to me essential that if we want to rebuild Europe, somebody spoke of a new renaissance, okay, but a new renaissance should bring light, enthusiasm, having a goal to pursue, and these are narratives. If we have nothing to say which gives more than the economic satisfaction of having resolved a problem, okay, but giving sense to the whole of life. And this is what we are missing today, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other voice from the speakers, the panelists?
Sorry, Chairman. He asked also me. So I have right to speak or no?
Absolutely.
Or no? I asked you.
We just have many questions in less than 10 minutes, but please.
No. I obedient. I am formally in the obedience. So decide.
You are the Lord of the house, of course. You have the right
Yeah,
to speak.
just concise. If it's concise, then we
He's
can.
the chairman in this moment.
Please, Monsignor.
Thank you. I agree. That's simple. But I think it's more deeply than the narrative. Is that there are something that the Pope Francis called the mainstream, the pensée unique, say the French people that come from the sociologists from France, that they don't want to have religion, because they consider that man is God. Man is God. And they say, we have a meeting, very fantastic meeting with the philosophy of religion was Professor Olivetti, and was a very famous, in this moment, professor communist that was in dialogue with Olivetti in Santiago de la Sapienza in a meeting with the Laureate Catholic. So, and I remember he said, yes, we want to save religion because religion is consolation for the people, and it's good. It's the opium of the people. So it's very. We are also the tax to save religion. So this is the question. The man today, in the pensée unique, believe that is God. They can save by himself, not need other things. This is the real problem. Don't want to speak about religion, not only Christian, but any religion. This is the idea that have Pope Benedict, and I think is perfect. He understands really, as theologian, the real problem of the European country. So it's very complicated because the majority, the money, the Pope say, the dictatorship of the money. We have here recently a meeting about the post-truth. Post-truth. This is the question. They don't believe not in good, not in truth, not in nothing. Only in power, money, and not for all, only for the people to have the power. So this is the question. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you. Professor Pozzo.
Yes, very short. Your Excellency Minarat, it was me who talked about the new Renaissance, but I didn't invent it. It's that the idea of the new Renaissance is on the table. It is Madame von der Leyen who speaks about it. But I wanted to, as regards the narrative, Marot said the 20th century will either be religion or religious, or it will not be. And now, and he was right, he's right in that. And now I say, as regards the narrative, Monsignor Minarat speaks about, the narrative of Europe, either will it global or it will not be. So we need to include Africa, and we need to include China. because it's only reflecting together that we can produce a contribution, and possibly Europe is in the position of providing a contribution, but it must not be self-referential. It must be open.
Yes.
Thank you so much. I understand this was a remark to the previous.
Yes.
Right. So, question, Professor Grodzicki?
Yeah, I'd like to build up on Professor Buttiglione's idea of mass movement. And there is good news because over 75% of Europeans support that EU institutions have more competences in social issues and in tackling crises. So there is some grounding in public opinion in Europe for such a movement. And this might sound that it goes against the European treaties, as Minister Giovannini said earlier, but in the European Treaty, we also found the principle of subsidiarity, which says that EU should act when single countries are insufficient in their actions. And now when we think of many crises which we have at the moment, or catastrophes even, when we think of public health, when we think of issues of decent work and incomes, environmental stability, or even care, there could be treated to some extent as European public goods, whereby actions of individual countries or locations quickly translate or spill over to other countries. So this might be some justification for more involvement of European Union in the social sphere. Thank you.
Does any of the speakers want to respond to that? Okay, thank you so much. So the final 3 minutes go to Professor Zamani.
Thank you.
We have
No,
time because we have
Let
1 hour
let me
for the dinner. So
draw your attention. In 1989, Jacques Delors, when he left the presidency of the Commission, published the famous Delors report, where he indicated what would have been the further steps of the European Union. 3 years afterwards, 1992, Maastricht Treaty was signed. Now, the Maastricht Treaty is exactly the opposite of the Delors report. Few people dare to talk about that, because this is a typical case of a treason, whereby at the beginning, everybody applauded to Jacques Delors, and then they did exactly the opposite. And that is, politicians, they signed the Maastricht Treaty. Why they never gave us evidence? Or because in theory, one could change minds, but you should give evidence. In particular, 3 points. First, what you mentioned just now, the subsidiarity principle. That is tricky, because what passed in the European Union is not the principle of subsidiarity, because they refer to Grotius' definition of subsidiarity in 1615, where subsidiarity is what we call nowadays vertical subsidiarity. But that is not subsidiarity. That is delegation of power. And even most intellectuals keep on saying stupid things without realizing. Subsidiarity is a different meaning, which was elaborated before the reform, not after, before. And the idea was to have, in the process of decision-making, both the state, what we call today the state, the market, and the community intervening on a parity level. So in Europe, we keep on talking about subsidiarity, but that is not subsidiarity at all. At the most, that is decentralization. Now, decentralization is a good thing, but it's not to be confused. Why people confused? Of course, because the subsidiarity principle was born within the Catholic tradition. And so Catholicism was to be repressed, because you know the trick, the intellectual. And the intellectuals, instead of speaking the truth. Second point, the problem, the battle between the so-called welfarists versus marketeers. There were two schools of thought. Is welfare which generates growth, or growth which generates welfare? who won the battle at the time of Maastricht Treaty? The marketeers. So first growth, then welfare, which means first each country should grow. And if you do not grow enough, bad on you. So you cannot afford giving welfare services to the people. Because that was, but Delors did the opposite. Delors, who was very intelligent in demonstrating that welfare saves it's a factor for growth, because if you treat people in a certain way, you send people to school, blah, 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 etc., then the opposite is true. And in fact, that is the reason why even nowadays in the European Union, we do not have yet a social policy, as Rocco was mentioned, etc. The other example has to do with the distinction between what we can call the monetarist versus realist. That is a bit more technical. In other words, there were two schools of thought. First, a unification of the currency, or the other school said first unification of the real sides of the economy. Now, Bob Mondale, American economist, Nobel Prize winner, he said, Europe is doing a terrible mistake. He passed away a few years ago. But he was right, because he said that the monetary union is the point of arrival, not the point of. Now we started with the unique currency and we are still in trouble, and in particular after the Brexit. So I say so because it is time, in my opinion, to rethink what happened. Because we cannot continue with keeping a Maastricht Treaty, not to mention about the Dublin Treaty and the Lisbon Treaty, which we have to be revised.
I think you're right. Okay, but just a logistical question. Do we have this Holy Mass at 5:30? Or
Yeah, of course. What is the reason? We have the dinner at 18, and we have the dinner at 80 is a ridiculous dinner. Normally, we have dinner at 7.
So let's continue the discussion then. If we have time and there's.
It's the time of the tea party, not the dinner.
Okay, fine. Then we continue discussions. I'm accepting next voices because Professor Zamanis was the last one. Professor Buttiglione.
Well, just a few words because I was there, Stefano. The idea that we had was first we put the currency. Then they will be obliged. No, I was in those years, I was in a close collaborator of Helmut Kohl. Then they will be compelled to make all the steps to fill the void that we live. And we make the Constitution. The point of our defeat was the Constitution, because the Constitution should have considered all the issues that you say. And the Constitution, we did not have it. And we had not the Maastricht Treaty. The problem is not the Maastricht Treaty, it's the Lisbon Treaty. The Lisbon Treaty is well, better than nothing, but really not much better than nothing. Just to fix some points of the story.
I want to add.
Okay, absolutely. Here, then here, and then my question to the panelists.
The Polish people not have right to doubt of the presence of God in the history after the Pope John Paul II to change the course of the history, because he was really instrument of the providence, because it was the faith of the Pope that changed the history, changed the course of the history. Is clear. Or you think that the change of your nation can?
As far as I know, it was a workers' movement called Solidarność.
Was Solidarność? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, workers' movement.
Solidarność, the same word in the interpretation of the Pope. Solidarność is justice. Solidarność is Christian. Is caritas. Is Christian gospel. So this is true, and this could also could also, we think with China, because the people, the thing that say Pope Benedict, the people need God. The soul of the people is anxious until find God. This is the idea. This Pope Benedict said, this is my hope. This is my hope, and this is also for China.
Thank you. Professor Donati, please go ahead.
Yeah, very, very shortly. I want to remind to Professor Buttiglione, to my friend Rocco, and also to Stefano, the main point to me is not the Maastricht Treaty and the project of constitution, but the Treaty of Nice, where human rights are defined. They are individualistic, and the family is equated to a privacy where you cannot enter. So that's, we cannot solve our problems, which are very much linked to the kind of relationships that people have together in respect to each other in the communities, having human rights defined only in individual terms. So this is, to me, the main point. And the Chart of Human Rights.
So a question from me to the speakers, summing up in a way this discussion and this entire day. We had so many things that were popping up, the EU institutions rebuilding trust, the information campaigns that we lost and we have to rebuild. We know that there was supposed to be a constitution and it's missing there. And this void is very much felt by us. The social policy is not there. The monetary union lacks something. And we might disagree on specific values, but for sure there is a need for some kind of higher hope, higher values, something more that is there than just pure economics. So does it mean, and this is the question to speakers, that maybe this is the narrative and this is the hope that we need to restore the idea of the European Constitution and try to draft it down, try to negotiate it? Who wants to put what in this constitution? Who needs what? And once we get these priorities right, maybe the project will be able to continue.
The conclusion.
Please, it's a question to the speakers. Do you think so? Does it make sense?
But what's the law? No want to put the Christianity as
Oh, maybe to the speakers of the panel, but
Maybe we've lost with if I can, Jan,
absolutely.
Just-
Go ahead, Mateusz.
just a very short, and we can even disagree within our team, so to speak.
the masonry.
Yeah, I think that
Don't stick out.
okay, yeah. Excuse me. So my point would be on both, I think, themes discussed on this panel. Firstly, in terms of incarnating the values is probably not the best word. The spirit is much of a better word. Yeah, the spirit. And I don't remember who said this today, but confessing a religion of incarnation makes making things real, changing into flesh and blood, really essential.
This is
So-
Pope Benedict.
Yes, and this was I think in Professor Pozzo's presentation. So, and this, however distant it might seem, I think it translates also to the idea of constitution, because at least my take when I was looking at this process was, and maybe important thing to add, and is also my take when I discuss with other movements who are interested in reform of the Union, the European Union, and who focus, in my opinion, falsely, simply on the political side of it. But while talking of democratization or giving citizens more voice, which is a good idea, they divide politics and
I would use the word economics in the proper sense of the word, not kind of abstract digits, but oikonomia in terms of the way of life. And to translate it into policies now, and somebody made a very good remark, Minister Giovannini, that all the working big political projects like the United States were able to bring cohesion because they were solving people's everyday life problems. And I think that the example of great Rooseveltian project that took the US from polarization, from economic crisis, from a deep spiritual crisis, really, is a very good one. People saw that this set of institutions cares for them in direct terms. So and this is a conservative, and I will conclude on that. This is a conservative Polish analyst of European affairs, Professor Cichocki, who said that if we are to rebuild union, we are to rebuild it alongside, and not maybe even alongside, but through policies, not through, like, people, I would say very simply, people right now in crisis wouldn't be interested in a discussion about constitution that gives them nothing in terms of the crisis they're facing. That would be fun just for activists who have resources and time and energy to spend. If we were to incarnate it, so to speak, the spirit of the enlightenment of the gospel, this needs to translate into helping people whose lives are in danger or whose lives are being degraded, not in simply materialistic terms, but the social fabric of trust and fraternity that is falling apart. So that would be kind of my, thank you.
Thank you so much. The discussion is still open. I'm inviting more voices, new voices, possibly.
I'll take it.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, just so I know I'm not famous, so my name is Esther Lynch, just so that people know who I am. I think this is a very interesting discussion, and I think completely agree that the European Union has lost its way. And for some time, when we went to the financial crisis, it was almost like the purpose of the European Union was the protection of the euro.
Yeah.
And that became the purpose of the human at work, was the protection of the euro. And we saw that evidenced in particular my own country of Ireland, where we had minimum wages being dropped and decisions being made in the full knowledge that the consequence of those decisions is that the people who would be impacted were the most vulnerable, the people who never got the benefit of the boom, and they paid for it. Then, in fairness, when Jean-Claude Juncker took over, he did try to signal with the European Pillar of Social Rights a change of direction. And I thought the discussion that we had, which related to the reciprocity, was an interesting one. And then we went on to this, well, you know, what can the European Union do? It's bound by the treaties. It can do this and it can't do that. And I'm very aware at the moment, because representing working people, that the main piece of legislation that could change that is the minimum wage directive. It could change that. It could put a shield in place so that never again could the IMF or the ECB or the EU turn up in a country and say, to protect everybody else and the financial system, you have to reduce your minimum wage. That piece of legislation will do that. But it's not the EU that's stopping that advancing, it's member states. This is decisions by member states to stop that advancing. And it strikes me that is a bit missing from the discussion, is the relationship between the member state and then the EU institutions. And I'm just wondering how can we include that, not because I have an answer, but simply because I think it's a piece of the thinking that's a bit missing.
Thank you for this voice.
I think sister was also raising her hand. Sister, no, okay.
I seriously looked everyone in the eye and I don't see any other voices. So thanks to all the panelists, to all the guests, to all the speakers and observers as well, that you stayed with us this long.